My name is Peter Rickaby. I'm the chair of the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group, and I've been kind of living with PAS 2035, the new domestic retrofit standard, for the last 2.5 years. So this is part of the process for me of combing it out of my hair and getting away. So I want to just kind of give you a quick rundown on what's in the standard, but also why it's in the standard through the work of the Retrofit Standards Task Group. The Retrofit Standards Task Group its home is at BSI. It's a group of technical experts, and it was founded as one of the outputs or one of the recommendations of the Each Home Counts report. The Each Home Counts report said there should be a task group to set up a framework of standards. So we have a group of 20-odd technical experts in retrofit whose job is to look at, in a strategic way, at how a framework of standards for retrofit can be developed. Objectives of the group are these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'd make the point that they're not just about energy efficiency. They're about health and well-being. They're about functionality. They're about the architectural heritage. They're about the performance gap, and they're about unintended consequences as well. So it's a very broad remit we gave to the task group. And the principles the group adopted were to focus on materials and workmanship and processes in retrofit, in other words, on what's done to the dwelling, not to focus on necessarily the competency of the people who are doing things to the dwelling. We're looking at the outcomes rather than the processes, really. We also want to make retrofit standards accessible, and Claire, who's chairing this session, is actually leading on creating a portal through which members of the Trustmark scheme can get access to the standards in a much more quick and easy and cheap online way than having to spend 100 quid on a printed book. And we also took a decision in principle that we would combine technical standards with guidance. So PAS 2035, as you'll see, contains many elements that are not normative requirements of the standard. They're guidance about how to do things. And we're also adding to the standard online click-through guidance to start to enhance that process. So we're trying to make the whole process less opaque to the user and more accessible to the user. This is what the Retrofit Standards Task Framework looks like. At the top there, you see the same stuff that Phil was just showing you, just reproduced in a slightly different way. So we have the Each Home Counts quality mark, Trustmark, at top center, and their code of conduct and customer charter on either side, both of which also came out of the Each Home Counts review. And then the middle box is the first product of the Retrofit Standards Task Group, if you like. It's the overarching end-to-end new domestic retrofit standard called Publicly Available Specification 2035, PAS 2035, Retrofitting Dwellings to Improve Energy Efficiency, Specifications and Guidance. And then that's not the end of the story, though, because it's only the overarching standard for the framework. There will be more, and there already is more, in that PAS 2035 refers to 3 types of other standards, and by referring to them, it makes them mandatory for compliance. So it brings in lots of other standards from out there as part of the retrofit standards that apply to projects. So on the left-hand bottom box, other BSI standards, typically PAS 2030, which is the installation standard, BS 5250, which is the condensation standard, BS 7913, which deals with conservation of historic buildings. So all of those are brought in, and many others, into the picture. Over on the bottom right, there are non-BSI standards, like the MCS standards for low and zero carbon technologies, like the insulation industry standards for installation of installation, and some things from organizations like SIBSI. And then in the middle bottom box, the Retrofit Standards Task Group is working on a whole suite of new standards for BSI to develop in conjunction with other partners to enhance the framework. And some of these new standards will actually replace bits of the current edition of PAS 2035. So we're proposing a standard on assessment of dwellings for retrofit. We're proposing a standard on air tightness, ventilation, thermal comfort, and indoor air quality to form part of the framework. We're proposing a standard on energy advice, and we're quite well advanced actually with work on a building performance evaluation standard. And all of those new standards will take about another 18 months, 2 years to develop, but they should, in some cases, replace great chunks of past 2035 with the latest thinking. But past 2035 itself, that's its title, it applies to any domestic retrofit project, not just to eco. Anybody procuring domestic retrofit work, whether it be a householder or a housing association or anybody else, the government can require the use of past 2035, and that will be right away from publication in the middle of May this year. It may not be coming into eco for another 19 months, but we will be able to apply the standard. PAS 2035 must be used in conjunction with PAS 2030, which is the installer standard. The installer must have a PAS 2035 compliant design, and the PAS 2035 compliant design must be installed in accordance with PAS 2030. So the two standards are inextricably locked together. And PAS 2035, as I've already said, requires the use of many other framework standards. For compliance, every project has to have a retrofit coordinator. That's a requirement of PAS 2035. And Phil mentioned retrofit coordinators, and I know that Russell's going to do the same. So they're central to our argument about quality in retrofit, having a retrofit coordinator. The retrofit coordinator is a kind of expert retrofit project manager, specially trained and qualified, and they're responsible for ensuring that PAS 2035 is complied with, and they're also responsible for protecting the client's interest and the public's interest. And one of the things that we've never had in this industry is somebody whose job is to protect the public interest. So we need that. And with respect to the client's interest, it's never been the case in this industry before that the industry has agreed with its clients what the intended outcomes from a project might be. And so the retrofit coordinator's job, or one of them, is to agree with the client what are the intended outcomes from this project and write them down and agree with them. And then at the end of the project, part of PAS 2035 is a monitoring and evaluation process, the first step in which is to check that the agreed outcomes have been achieved and that there were no unintended consequences, and if there were unintended consequences, or if they weren't achieved, then do something about it to bring some redress into the process. For the first time, we're trying to close the loop and make the client, in response to each home counts, make the customer, the householder, central to the retrofit process. This is a very simplified flow diagram of PAS 2035. If you think that's too complicated, I've got a much more complicated one to show you in a few minutes. But essentially, this allows me to take you through the process from top to bottom here. There are some preliminary considerations, there's some advice and guidance in PAS 2035 about good ways of going about it. But essentially, the project starts with the appointment of the team, and principally the retrofit coordinator, as well as the advisor, the assessor, the designer, the evaluator. And that's done in response to a risk assessment. The risk assessment determines two things: which of three paths through the PAS, paths A, B, and C, the project should follow according to how technically risky it is, and what qualifications are the various members of the professional team required to have. And the more risky the project is, the more onerous the path is, and the more qualified the people involved have to be. Once the risk assessment's been done, there is a whole dwelling assessment, including a ventilation assessment to be carried out. And if it's a building that's traditionally constructed or protected, there's also an assessment of its significance under BS 7913. Once those things are done, there is an improvement option evaluation required, so that we're forcing the team to look at what are the options for this home, what things should be done to it, and what are the best improvement measures. So no longer will it be possible for somebody to come over the horizon with a bag of money labelled ECO or EWI, and that's what you get, because that's what the money's for. Now they have to assess what are the appropriate things to do to this dwelling. And following on from the improvement option evaluation, they make a medium-term improvement plan for the dwelling. They identify what does this dwelling need by 2050, and even if we can't do it all now, we have a plan for how we're going to get there over a period of perhaps 20 or more years. And the medium-term improvement plan is exactly the basis of the passport that Phil mentioned in his talk a few minutes ago. That's the basis of the whole process. Once those processes have been gone through, some advice is given to the client, some approvals are sought, and then there's a design process. And the design process is differentiated according to the path, the risk path, A, B, and C. And that leads to a PAS 2035 compliant design for the retrofit project. That's handed over to the installer, who works to PAS 2030 and is responsible for installation, testing, commissioning, and handover. As part of that process, they produce a method statement, and that method statement is a way of testing that the design is appropriate and valid for the particular dwellings. Once the installation has been completed, there's some handover advice delivered under PAS 2035, and there is a monitoring and evaluation process under PAS 2035, which is escalatory. The first step is, did we achieve the intended outcomes? Were there any unintended consequences? If the answer to the first one is no, or the answer to the second question is yes, it escalates to a bit more investigation of what went wrong, and eventually we get to quite a long and detailed investigation of problems to get to the bottom of the process and provide the arrow at the left of the diagram, the feedback back to the project team as to what worked well and what didn't work well. A bit of learning in there. I just wanted to dwell a little bit on the risk assessment that starts the whole process off. It's carried out by the retrofit coordinator. It's based on what we call triage data. You don't necessarily have to go to the dwelling to do the risk assessment. You can collect data from EPCs and other databases and Google Earth and Google Street View and things that you're told by the client. And it's done before the dwelling is subjected to the whole dwelling assessment and its ventilation assessment. When you do the risk assessment, you arrive at path A, path B, or path C through the PAS itself. And that depends on 5 criteria: the number of dwellings in the project, the number of measures in the project, the construction of the buildings, the built form of the buildings, and out of those 5 criteria arise differentiation into the 3 paths. And as you might expect, the highest risks go with high-rise buildings, traditionally constructed buildings, and protected historic buildings. Traditionally constructed buildings are at least in path B, and high-rise and protected buildings are always in risk path C, and they get more attention. So the assessed risk determines the qualifications required by the assessor and by the designer, and where the buildings require specialist skills on behalf of the assessor or the designer. Perhaps they're traditionally constructed, perhaps they're protected, perhaps they're high-rise, perhaps they're vulnerable for other reasons, then those additional qualifications are brought into play. And then the assessed risk determines the path through the PAS. Path A, simple requirements, not a whole lot different from normal practice at the moment, mostly aimed at projects that involve only 1 or 2 measures. Path B, most projects will fall into Path B, and that has more onerous requirements. And Path C, the highest risk buildings, much more onerous requirements. The whole dwelling assessment must include all of these things, and I know you can't read it, there's loads of it in there, but the point of showing you a load of bullet points is that it's a comprehensive whole dwelling assessment. It includes not just what you do for an EPC, figuring out what its SAP is, and bunging some data into RD SAP. It includes understanding the building's context, understanding the building's heritage, its construction, its condition, identifying constraints on things that might be done, looking at the defects that are there and how they might be fixed before any retrofit work is done, and then doing a proper survey to establish the heat losses and the efficiencies and all those kinds of things so we can model the building's performance properly. And that includes an occupancy assessment so we can tailor the modeling to the actual occupancy if required. There's also a ventilation assessment, which is in Annex C of the PAS. And what this says is that whenever we go into a dwelling, we must assess whether the ventilation is adequate. And inadequate is evidenced by there being some condensation and mold present in the building, or it has no working ventilation system, or an incomplete ventilation system, Or if it is intended by the retrofit project to improve the air tightness, the air permeability, below 5, then intermittent ventilation or passive stack ventilation is deemed inadequate. If the ventilation is inadequate, is assessed as inadequate, then the designer must include an upgrade of the ventilation into the PAS 2035 compliant design. And that upgrade says that if the air permeability is going to be less than 5, sorry, it's going to be more than 5, then it must have a fully operative, complete intermittent extract ventilation or passive stack ventilation system. If the intended air permeability is going to be less than 5, the new dwelling must have a mechanical extract ventilation system, a continuous mechanical extract ventilation system, MVHR or a PIV system in place. It also says in the standard that the system capacity must not be the minimum capacity specified in Building Regs Approved Document F. It must be based on full occupancy of the dwelling to provide adequate ventilation capacity, and it must have demand control to ensure that the capacity that the system delivers is consistent with the actual demands room by room in the dwelling. So we're looking for more effective ventilation systems. In the design, path A, the simplest path, allows for the design of single measure system-based improvements by specialists. And so the specialist designer of, say, an EWI system can design the project, but it has to be, it says approval here, but that's wrong. It has to be reviewed by the retrofit coordinator to ensure that it's suitable for the dwelling. At path B and path C, we require the improvement option evaluation and the medium-term retrofit plan, and they can be based on a SAP assessment or a PHPP assessment. And the medium-term retrofit plan has to identify and prioritize the improvements that the dwelling would need by 2050, even if they're not going to be put in as part of the immediate project. It's to inform the occupants, the owner of the building, what things need to be done over the next few years. And it's the basis of Phil's building passport. And then path C mostly looks at very high-risk buildings and nearly always requires specialist expertise in traditional buildings and some qualifications, some professional qualifications in dealing with buildings with historical significance. Still on design, this is the scope of the design. It depends on the risk path, but this is basically all these things need to be taken into consideration. Not least providing for the outcomes agreed with the client, pretty important. It has to be based on the assessment, it has to take account of the architectural heritage context, it has to take account of planning and building control requirements, it must allow for the management of moisture in the building, both inside the building and in the building fabric. It must include construction details for the corners, junctions and edges, because we know from experience that that's where retrofit goes wrong, where things meet. It must include a ventilation upgrade if required, as we've seen, and it must specify requirements for testing, commissioning and handover, and finally it must specify what guarantees and warranties are required. And the interfaces are dealt with by a mechanism in the standard called the measures interaction matrix. And again, I know you can't see this, it's essentially a table of all measures against all measures. And it has 4 colours in it. If there's a yellow box, if you have a combination of measures, 2 measures or more in your project, if there's a yellow box at the intersection of those 2 measures, you must draw a construction detail of how that junction is handled. So that might be the edge of an insulation layer, a junction between an insulated roof and an insulated wall, something of that kind. If there's an amber box at the intersection of your 2 or more measures, then that means that they don't maybe physically meet, but they do require compatible specifications. So that would be, for example, that the ventilation system is specified to match the air permeability of the envelope, or that the heating system and its controls are specified to match the new reduced heat loss of the retrofitted dwelling. If there's a green box, it means those 2 measures don't interact, so you don't have to worry about it. And if there's a red box, you shouldn't be doing those 2 things together. That's the kind of banned box. If it's red, don't do it. So it's things that are technically incompatible. And you can get this from the BSI website. It's been around for past 2030 for a while, so if you want to inspect it and see what it says in detail, it's there for you. When we come to installation, the installation must comply with PAS 2030, and there's a new edition of that which we've updated, 2030-2019. The retrofit installer must work to a design that's compliant with PAS 2035. And PAS 2030 includes requirements for validating the design, preparing a method statement, ensuring that qualified or competent operatives are employed on the job, making a pre-installation building inspection to ensure that the work is capable of being carried out, the actual installation process itself, and that's specified through many dozens of annexes, procedures for testing, commission and handover, as in the design, provision of guarantees and warranties as requested by the design, and record keeping for the whole process. Once the installation is complete, we come back to PAS 2035 and we have a monitoring and evaluation process, the objectives of which are to confirm that the intended outcomes have been achieved and to identify any unintended consequences. Basic monitoring is simply a questionnaire that says, have we done these things? It confirms the outcomes and the customer's satisfaction. However, if the customer is not satisfied or the outcomes are not consistent with the intention, then intermediate monitoring and subsequently advanced monitoring can be used in order to, can be invoked in order to further investigate the problem and get to the bottom of it, and if necessary, specify the appropriate redress. So we're not going to let people get away with shoddy work. And clearly the outcomes of the monitoring and evaluation process are going to be of interest to Trustmark in this whole process. So finally, PAS 2035 actually in reality looks more complicated. This is the complicated flowchart. I'm not going to take you through it, but we spent much blood and tears producing this, understanding it. On the left there you've got the contents of the standard. That's the contents page summarized. And this is the actual flow with colours used for the three paths that you would follow through the PAS to deliver a retrofit project, with the retrofit coordinator starting right at the top. Thank you.